First contact tensions. The colony's biodome shuddered under the weight of the acid storm outside, the faint hiss of corrosive rain sizzling against the reinforced shields. Lien Kale adjusted his respirator, the faint hum of the atmospheric processors filling the air with a steady, mechanical rhythm. He wiped the sweat from his brow, his calloused hands gripping the wrench tightly as he tightened the bolts on the malfunctioning oxygen regulator. The colony's survival depended on these machines, and he wasn't about to let some corporate overlords waltz in and take it all away. Across the negotiation table, Captain Zanara Vex of the Vinthri Dominion leaned forward, her iridescent scales shimmering under the harsh UV lights of the colony's command center. Her slit pupils narrowed as she studied the holographic display of the planet's terraforming progress, her forked tongue flicking out briefly. "Your efforts are quaint," she said, her voice a low, sibilant purr that sent an involuntary shiver down Lien's spine. "But this planet's mineral core belongs to Dominion Corp. Your little project is in the way." Lien's jaw tightened. He'd spent 5 years on this rock, turning it from a barren wasteland into something resembling a habitable world. The thought of some alien megacorp swooping in and claiming it all made his blood boil. "We've made this planet breathable," he said, his voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. "You can't just." "Can't?" Zanara interrupted, her tail coiling around the leg of her chair. The movement was deliberate, almost predatory. She tapped a clawed finger on the table, and the holographic display flickered, showing a sudden drop in oxygen levels and a spike in soil toxicity. "Your machines are failing, human. Observe." Lien lunged for the controls, his fingers flying over the interface as he tried to stabilize the readings. Their hands brushed briefly, and a static charge arced between them, making Zanara recoil slightly. Her crest feathers flared a deep crimson, a sign of irritation, or something else. "Your technology is as delicate as your human ego," she sneered, though her voice wavered just enough for Lien to notice. He ignored the jab, focusing on the task at hand. The oxygen level stabilized, but the damage was done. Zanara leaned back in her chair, her tail flicking lazily. "You see. Your efforts are futile. Dominion Corp has the resources to extract the minerals efficiently. Your colony will be compensated, of course." "Compensated?" Lien snapped, slamming the wrench down on the table. "This isn't about credits. This is about survival. We've built something here, something that could support thousands of lives. You're talking about tearing it all down for profit." Zanara's eyes narrowed, her scales shifting to a darker hue. "Sentimentality has no place in business, human. This planet's resources are valuable, and Dominion Corp will not be denied." The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with unspoken threats. Lien took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. He couldn't afford to lose his temper, not with so much at stake. "There has to be another way," he said, his voice softer now. "A compromise. We've already made significant progress with the terraforming. If you give us more time." "Time is a luxury we do not have," Zanara interrupted, standing abruptly. Her movements were fluid, almost hypnotic, as she circled the table, her tail trailing behind her. "The Dominion's fleet will arrive in 3 solar cycles. If you do not vacate the planet by then, we will remove you by force." Lien's heart sank. 3 solar cycles. That wasn't enough time to finish the terraforming, let alone evacuate the colony. He looked at Zanara, searching for any hint of compassion in her alien features. But her expression was unreadable, her eyes cold and calculating. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This planet could be a home for both our people. We don't have to be enemies." For a moment, Zanara hesitated. Her crest feathers twitched, and her scales shifted to a softer hue. But then she straightened, her expression hardening once more. "Sentimentality," she repeated, her voice cold. "It will be your undoing." She turned and strode toward the door, her tail flicking dismissively. But before she left, she paused and glanced back at Lien. For what it's worth, human, I admire your tenacity. But it will not save you. The door hissed shut behind her, leaving Lien alone in the command center. He sank into a chair, running a hand through his hair. 3 solar cycles. He had 3 solar cycles to figure out how to save his colony, and maybe, just maybe, change Zanara's mind. The next day, Lien was in the repair bay, elbow deep in a malfunctioning atmospheric processor, when Zanara appeared in the doorway. She was dressed in a sleek, form-fitting suit that accentuated her lithe frame, her scales shimmering in the dim light. Lien didn't notice her at first, too focused on the task at hand. Your method is inefficient, she said, her voice cutting through the hum of machinery. Lien jumped, nearly dropping his wrench. He turned to see Zanara leaning against the doorframe, her arms crossed over her chest. Vinthari nanodrills would be far more effective, she continued, stepping closer. Nanodrills would crack the bedrock and kill the lichen, Lien countered, wiping his hands on a rag. This ecosystem's fragile. Like your patience. Her tail twitched, a sign of irritation, but there was a glint of amusement in her eyes. When he reached across her for a tool, his forearm grazed her chest scales. A low rumble escaped her throat, something between a growl and a purr. Careful, human, she warned. My people bite. Noted, Lien replied, holding her gaze. But you're not here to sabotage us anymore, are you? Zanara's comlink buzzed, the encrypted frequency of Dominion Corp breaking the tension. She silenced it with a flick of her claw, her eyes never leaving Lien's. Perhaps I'm here to observe, she said, her voice softer now. To see if your methods have merit. Lien raised an eyebrow. And? She tilted her head, her crest feathers flaring slightly. You're stubborn. Reckless. But, not entirely without skill. It wasn't exactly a compliment, but it was enough to make Lien smile. High praise, coming from you. Zanara's lips curved into something resembling a smile, though it was hard to tell with her alien features. Don't let it go to your head, human. As she turned to leave, Lien called after her. Zanara. She paused, glancing back over her shoulder. Yes. If you really want to see what we're capable of, stick around. You might be surprised. For a moment, she said nothing. Then, with a flick of her tail, she disappeared into the corridor, leaving Lien alone with his thoughts, and the faint scent of ozone and something spicy lingering in the air. That night, Lien lay awake in his quarters, staring at the ceiling. The colony's fate hung in the balance, and he couldn't shake the feeling that Zanara was the key to saving it. But could he trust her? And more importantly, could he afford not to? As the acid rain continued to fall outside, Lien made a decision. He would fight for his colony, for the people who called it home. And if that meant finding common ground with an alien commander, then so be it. The storm outside raged on, but inside, a spark of hope had been lit. And Lien intended to fan it into a flame. Gravity of attraction. The colony's atmospheric processors groaned under the strain of the acid-laced winds, their rhythmic hum now a labored wheeze. Lien wiped grime from his goggles, his shirt clinging to his back as he crawled through the cramped access tunnel beneath the biodome's eastern sector. Sweat dripped onto the rusted metal beneath him, sizzling faintly where it met residual toxins. 3 solar cycles left. The countdown pulsed in his skull like a drumbeat. Above him, the sound of scaled footsteps paused at the tunnel's entrance. This is beneath a commander's dignity, Zanara's voice echoed down, laced with disdain. Lien smirked, adjusting the plasma torch in his hand. You wanted to observe, remember? Observation's messy. He heard a low hiss, then the shuffle of fabric as Zanara reluctantly lowered herself into the tunnel. Her bioluminescent markings cast an eerie cyan glow over the corroded pipes, revealing hairline fractures snaking through the colony's main coolant line. Your repairs are temporary, she said, claws tapping a fractured valve. Like bandages on a plasma burn. Bandages keep people alive long enough to heal, Lien shot back, slicing through a warped panel. The torch flared, illuminating Zanara's face, her slit pupils dilated, tracking the movement of his hands. A sudden tremor rocked the tunnel. Dust rained down as alarms blared overhead. Zanara's tail snapped out, bracing them both against the walls. Stress fracture in Sector 5, a voice crackled through Lien's comlink. Oxygen gardens compromised. They emerged into chaos. The oxygen garden, a sprawling chamber of genetically engineered ferns and algae tanks, was engulfed in violet flames. Colonists scrambled with fire suppressors, but the alien fire clung to the vegetation like living tendrils. Dominion Corp's patented mining accelerant, Zanara growled, her crest feathers flattening. It ignites in high-oxygen environments. Lien's stomach dropped. You knew this would happen. Her gaze cut to him, sharp as a vibroblade. I knew they'd act. Not when. Or how. She ripped a burning vine from the wall, her scaled hands immune to the flames. Your people need respirators. Now. They worked side by side, Zanara carving fire breaks with her plasma pistol while Lien jury-rigged the ventilation system. When a support beam cracked overhead, she tackled him to the ground, her body shielding his as debris rained down. Why? Lien coughed, her weight pressing him into the scorched soil. Why help us? Zanara's forked tongue flicked, close enough to graze his ear. You amuse me, human. She rolled off him, but not before he caught the tremor in her claws. Later, in the smoldering ruins of the garden, Lien found her inspecting a shard of Dominion Corp branded metal. This wasn't an accident, he said quietly. No, she crushed the shard in her fist. It was a message. For me. He stepped closer. Why? Her tail coiled tight around her leg. I delayed my report. Suggested further evaluation of the colony's potential. The admission hung between them. Lien reached out, stopping just short of touching her arm. Thank you. Zanara jerked away. Sentimentality, she spat, but the word lacked its usual venom. That night, the storm reached critical levels. Lien found Zanara in the reactor core, her claws flying over the alien interface she'd jury-rigged to their systems. What are you doing? Stabilizing your failing grid with Vinteri code, she muttered. A child could write better algorithms than your engineers. He leaned over her shoulder, watching glyphs swirl across the hologram. Teach me. Her laugh was a dark melody. You'd need a decade. I'm a quick study. Their hands brushed reaching for the same control. The reactor hummed louder, bathing them in pulsating amber light. Zanara's breath hitched, a sound Lien hadn't heard before. Your heartbeat is distracting, she said hoarsely. Yours isn't exactly steady. When she turned, their faces were inches apart. The reactor's rhythm synced with the pounding in Lien's ears. A proximity alert shattered the moment. Zanara shoved him toward the exit. The shield generators. They raced through howling winds, the biodome's outer shield flickering like a dying star. Zanara scaled the generator tower with reptilian grace, Lien struggling behind. Your lack of claws is tragic, she shouted over the storm. Your lack of patience is, a lightning strike vaporized the walkway beneath him. Zanara's tail lashed out, wrapping around his waist. Grab on, she snarled, muscles straining as she hauled him up. Pressed against her back, Lien felt the ripple of powerful muscles beneath her scales. Told you I'd surprise you, he gasped. She made a noise that was almost a laugh. Never doubted it, human. The shield flared back to life seconds before the storm's peak hit. As the biodome groaned under the assault, Zanara didn't let go. In the exhausted quiet that followed, they sat in the reactor core's glow. Zenara examined Lien's blistered hands with clinical detachment. "You require medical attention," says the woman who wrestled flaming debris. Her claw traced a burn on his wrist. "My people heal quickly. Yours, linger." The touch sent sparks through him. "We're stubborn that way." Zenara's crest feathers slowly relaxed. "Stubbornness," she mused. "Perhaps it's not entirely a weakness." When the alarms sounded again, earlier than expected, they rose as one. Dominion Corp's warships pierced the storm clouds, their silhouettes predatory against the electric sky. Zenara bared her fangs in a grin that sent heat racing down Lien's spine. Ready to show them human surprises? He activated the overload sequence on his wrist comm. "Thought you'd never ask." The warships loomed like blackened teeth against the storm-racked sky, their hulls glistening with Dominion Corp's insignia. Lien stood at the edge of the biodome's observation deck, his fingers tightening around the railing as the first dropship detached from the mothership. Zenara stood beside him, her scales shimmering with an almost predatory gleam. "They're early," Lien muttered, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. Impatient, Zenara replied, her slit pupils narrowing as she tracked the dropship's descent. "Typical of Dominion Corp. They don't like waiting." Lien glanced at her, noting the tension in her coiled tail and the way her claws flexed unconsciously. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly. "You could leave. They're here for the colony, not you." Her crest feathers flared, a ripple of crimson that betrayed her agitation. "And go where, human?" "Back to a fleet that sees me as a tool. A commander who follows orders without question." She turned to face him, her violet eyes burning with an intensity that made his breath catch. "I've spent my life fighting for causes I didn't believe in. Maybe it's time I fought for something that matters." The words hung between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Lien opened his mouth to respond, but the sound of the dropship's engines roaring to life cut him off. The vessel landed just outside the biodome's perimeter, its ramp lowering to reveal a squad of heavily armed Vinthari soldiers. At their head stood a tall, broad-shouldered Vinthari male, his scales a deep onyx that seemed to absorb the light. His crest feathers were tipped with gold, a mark of high rank, and his eyes glinted with cold authority. "Commander Vex," he called, his voice carrying the weight of command. "You've overstayed your welcome." Zenara stepped forward, her tail lashing behind her. "Commander Draxus," she replied, her tone icy. "I wasn't aware my mission had a time limit." Draxus's lips curled into a sneer, revealing sharp fangs. "Your mission was to secure the planet for Dominion Corp, not fraternize with the locals." His gaze flicked to Lien, lingering for a moment before returning to Zenara. "You've been compromised. Stand down, and we'll consider this a momentary lapse in judgment." Zenara's claws flexed, and Lien could see the tension in her muscles as she prepared to strike. He stepped forward, placing himself between her and Draxus. "This colony is under my protection," he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "You're not taking it without a fight." Draxus laughed, a low, rumbling sound that sent a chill down Lien's spine. "A fight? With what, human? Your pathetic machines and a handful of frightened colonists." He gestured to the soldiers behind him. "Take them." The Vinthari soldiers advanced, their plasma rifles humming with lethal energy. Lien activated his wrist comm, sending a signal to the colony's defenses. The ground beneath the soldiers erupted in a burst of light as hidden turrets sprang to life, their energy beams cutting through the advancing squad. Zenara moved like lightning, her claws slicing through the air as she engaged the remaining soldiers. Lien followed close behind, his plasma torch doubling as a makeshift weapon. Together, they fought with a synchronicity that surprised even them, their movements fluid and precise. But the odds were against them. Draxus watched from the sidelines, his expression one of cold amusement. "You can't win, Vex," he called. "Surrender now, and I might spare your pet human. Zenara's response was a snarl as she disarmed another soldier, her tail whipping out to send him crashing into the ground. I'd rather die than go back to being your puppet, she spat. Lien's heart pounded as he fought to keep up with her, his muscles screaming in protest. He could feel the tide turning, the soldiers closing in around them. Zenara, he gasped, we need a plan. She glanced at him, her eyes blazing with determination. Trust me, she said, before grabbing his arm and pulling him into a nearby maintenance tunnel. The tunnel was narrow and dark, the walls slick with condensation. Zenara led the way, her bioluminescent markings casting a faint glow that guided them through the maze. Behind them, the sound of pursuing footsteps echoed ominously. Where are we going? Lien asked, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The reactor core, Zenara replied, her voice tight with focus. If we overload the system, we can create a diversion big enough to buy us some time. Lien's eyes widened. Overload the reactor. That's insane. It could take out half the colony. Do you have a better idea? She snapped, her claws digging into his arm. He didn't. They reached the reactor core, the massive machine humming with barely contained energy. Zenara moved to the control panel, her claws flying over the interface as she input a series of commands. Lien watched in awe as the reactor's hum grew louder, the air crackling with static. This will give us about 5 minutes, she said, stepping back. Enough time to get to the shuttle bay. Lien nodded, his heart pounding. Let's go. They sprinted through the tunnels, the sound of the reactor's growing whine spurring them on. As they reached the shuttle bay, the ground beneath them shook violently, the reactor's overload sending shockwaves through the colony. The pursuing soldiers were thrown off balance, giving Lien and Zenara the precious seconds they needed to board a shuttle. Zenara took the pilot's seat, her claws dancing over the controls as the shuttle's engines roared to life. Hold on, she warned, before launching them into the storm-racked sky. The shuttle shuddered as it broke through the atmosphere, the colony shrinking behind them. Lien looked out the viewport, his heart heavy with the knowledge that they'd left so much behind. We'll come back, Zenara said, her voice firm. But first, we need allies. Lien turned to her, his expression grim. Allies? Who's going to help us against Dominion Corp? Zenara's lips curved into a faint smile. The Vinthari aren't the only ones with enemies in the galaxy, human. And I know just where to start. Unlikely alliances. The shuttle's engines hummed steadily as it hurtled through the void of space, the storm-racked planet now a distant speck behind them. Lien sat in the co-pilot's seat, his hands gripping the armrests as he stared out at the endless stars. Zenara's claws moved deftly over the controls, her expression focused but unreadable. Where are we going? Lien asked, breaking the silence. The Free Belt, Zenara replied, her voice calm but edged with tension. A neutral zone where Dominion Corp's reach is limited. There's a faction there, humans, Vinthari, and others, who've been fighting Dominion Corp for years. If anyone can help us, it's them. Lien frowned. And you think they'll trust us? A Dominion commander and a colony engineer? Zenara's tail flicked, a sign of her irritation. They'll trust me. I've worked with them before. Lien raised an eyebrow. Worked with them? As in, you helped them? She hesitated, her claws pausing over the controls. I've shared information. Passed along Dominion Corp's plans. It wasn't much, but it kept them alive. Lien leaned back in his seat, studying her. You've been playing both sides this whole time. Zenara's crest feathers flattened slightly. I've been trying to survive. Just like you. The shuttle's proximity alarm beeped, drawing their attention to the viewport. Ahead, a massive asteroid field came into view, its jagged rocks glinting in the starlight. Zenara adjusted their course, weaving the shuttle through the treacherous terrain with practiced ease. The free belt is hidden within the asteroid field, she explained. It's a haven for those who don't fit into Dominion Corp's vision of the galaxy. As they approached, a small space station came into view, its hull patched together from salvaged ships and scrap metal. It was a stark contrast to Dominion Corp's sleek, imposing vessels, but there was a rugged beauty to its chaotic design. Zenara guided the shuttle into the station's docking bay, the magnetic clamps securing them with a metallic clang. She powered down the engines and turned to Lien. "Stay close, and let me do the talking." He nodded, though his stomach churned with unease. The station's interior was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of oil and sweat. Alien faces of all shapes and sizes turned to watch them as they stepped off the shuttle, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. A tall, broad-shouldered human with a cybernetic arm stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he recognized Zenara. Well, he drawled. "If it isn't the Dominion's golden girl. What brings you to our little corner of the galaxy?" Zenara's tail coiled tightly around her leg, but her voice remained steady. "I need your help, Jax. Dominion Corp is planning something big, and I can't stop them alone." Jax crossed his arms, his cybernetic hand whirring softly. "And why should we trust you? Last I heard, you were leading raids on Freebelt outposts." "I was following orders," Zenara snapped, her crest feathers flaring. "But I'm done being their puppet. I've seen what they're capable of, and I won't stand by while they destroy innocent lives." Jax's gaze shifted to Lien. "And who's this?" "Lien Kale," Lien said, stepping forward. "I'm an engineer from the colony Dominion Corp tried to take. Zenara helped us fight them off." Jax raised an eyebrow. "An engineer, huh? You any good with a wrench?" Lien smirked. "I kept a failing colony alive for 5 years. I'd say I'm decent." Jax chuckled, the tension in the room easing slightly. "All right, I'll bite. But if this is some kind of setup." "It's not," Zenara said firmly. "We're here because we need allies. And because we have information that could turn the tide against Dominion Corp." Jax studied her for a moment before nodding. "Fine. Let's talk." The meeting room was cramped, its walls lined with maps and schematics of Dominion Corp facilities. Jax sat at the head of the table, flanked by a motley crew of humans and aliens. Zenara stood at the other end, her posture rigid as she explained their situation. Dominion Corp is planning to terraform dozens of planets, stripping them of their resources and leaving them uninhabitable, she said, her voice cutting through the room's tension. "They've already started on the colony Lien and I came from. If we don't stop them, they'll destroy countless lives." A Vinthari with deep green scales leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "And what do you expect us to do about it? We're barely holding our own as it is." "You've been fighting them for years," Lien interjected. "You know their weaknesses. If we combine your knowledge with Zenara's intel, we can hit them where it hurts." Jax stroked his chin, his cybernetic fingers clicking softly. "It's a risky play. But if we pull it off, we could cripple Dominion Corp's operations," Zenara finished. "Give the galaxy a fighting chance." The room fell silent as the faction leaders exchanged glances. Finally, Jax stood, his expression grim but determined. "All right. We're in. But if this goes south, you're on your own." Zenara nodded, her crest feathers relaxing slightly. "Thank you." As the meeting adjourned, Lien found himself alone with Zenara in the station's observation deck. The asteroid field stretched out before them, its jagged rocks glowing faintly in the starlight. "You didn't tell me you've been working with them," Lien said quietly. Zenara's tail flicked, a sign of her discomfort. "I didn't think it mattered. I didn't want to put them at risk." Lien turned to face her, his expression softening. "You've been fighting this war longer than I realized." She looked away, her claws flexing unconsciously. It's not a war I chose. But it's one I can't ignore anymore. Lien reached out, his hand brushing against hers. You're not alone in this, Zenara. We'll fight them together. Her crest feathers flared, and for a moment, she looked vulnerable. You don't know what you're signing up for, human. This won't be easy. Nothing worth fighting forever is, Lien replied, his voice steady. Zenara's gaze met his, and in that moment, the walls between them seemed to crumble. She stepped closer, her cool breath brushing against his skin. You're unlike any human I've ever met. Lien smiled faintly. And you're unlike any alien. Their lips met in a kiss that was equal parts desperation and hope, a silent promise to face whatever came next together. Supernova. Dominion Corp's assault came at dawn. Zenara stood between Lien and the corporate mercenaries, her tail lashing. Run, she ordered. Like hell. He activated the terraformer's overload sequence. We finish this together. As the machines purred to life, cleansing the atmosphere in a golden wave, Zenara kissed him fiercely. Stubborn human, she breathed. Annoying lizard, he grinned. The ground trembled, not from destruction, but from the first rain of newborn oceans.